Come along for the ride. You're going to see me destroy a 24 by 32 inch pastel painting. It's only about 75 to 80% complete. This thing has sat around since probably about March in my fermentation area. This is where I look at paintings I've done and I decide what's next. And I just have not been liking this. The color values that I selected were in the brighter side of the color palette. That particular day the car was parked there and you could see those cones of light coming through the fog. You could barely make out shapes of the barn and the trees just a little bit behind the car, and then everything just turns to fall off into the distance. So I like the concept, I like the idea, I like the tonality that I could get because it was a foggy day. That's just right up my alley since I like tonalism and I like to deal with narrow range of values. But I think what I have to do is I have to go from these lighter values and have the majority of the painting a little darker because it was real early morning, and maybe I can simulate it being a few hours earlier. So I'm going to destroy this and use darker colors for many of the parts that are much brighter than they are now. And then I will reduce even the light areas where the headlights and the light on the barn is. I will reduce that value also, but use a brighter or different hue color. I'll probably go back into some lighter colors, or the lighter end of the scale, and the reds and the oranges for those lights. But I will reduce their value from the light end of the scale to the darker end that I'm using in the rest of the painting. So come along for the ride, and I will put this on time lapse so that you can see parts of it, and I'll stop every now and then and tell you what I'm doing, and then we'll time lapse so you don't have to watch this whole process for several hours. Here are the colors I have selected. This bottom row is more about zone 3. When these colors are turned to gray, they'll fall into that zone 3 value out of a 10 value scale. Up in here are mostly 2s, and there's an occasional 1 value here and maybe here when we turn those to grays. So I'm narrowing the values going from the lighter end of the color hues and grays to the darker end to simulate maybe some wee hours in the morning before the sun pops out, and it makes more sense with the lights on the barn and the car. Okay, to start this I am going to start with the lighter values, and since I picked these oranges, this does not mean that the colors that I selected will be the final color. I am just trying, just like we do in the beginning of a painting, I'm trying to get some place setters in here that will let me, once I add some wet materials, will allow me to begin to make sense of how to proceed, since I'm going from these lighter zone values that are probably up in the 8, 9, and 10 range to the darker values that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to put some of these lighter values in, because once I put the dark over, then I will start to become a little confused visually as I proceed. Now you'll notice I'm not pressing really hard. I'm just trying to get a little bit of this color and this supposed darker light into some of these areas. And if the fog is out there, the fog is going to be reflecting some of that light of the sun, either as it comes over the horizon or is just still under the horizon, shining up on some of these foggy clouds. We'll call them clouds because that's what fog is. I'm going to go over these darker areas now with some colors that are much more silhouette-like, and I'm not staying in the lines and trying to be really careful here, because I know I have to remake this thing, and to remake it I have to kind of destroy it first. So all those little details, I'm not worried about capturing any of those as I lay in these new color values. I'm more interested in getting the values of these buildings and things pushed down towards the darker end of the scale. And I'll be adding some blues and blue violets into some of these areas also. Again, the idea is to start to get it covered the same as we would if we were starting from scratch, but here we have kind of the concept or the idea that we want to try to maintain a little bit of that, and where it lands ultimately we won't know until we get to the finish, but we'll at least be able to see by using this technique of remaking rather than throwing over or washing it all off and starting from scratch. I find this destruction and regenerative process much more satisfying than just, well, I'll get a blank canvas out and do this again and start over with a different set of values or color scheme. So I find that that is works for me. A lot of people have written me and said this is just too messy, I can't handle it. But the discovery process in the recreation of these things is really appealing to me. And you have to have a certain level of confidence from having worked outside in plein air to be able to do some of these things, because you are making up certain areas because you've covered them and recreating other areas. So the concept of these things being destroyed is important, that you have the confidence. The more you destroy your work and recreate it, the better and more confidence you'll have that, hey, I can destroy something and it's better the second time around. Oh, I want to get some more color in the sky, those foggy areas up in here and the dark of the sky up in here. I want to get those replaced before I go to time lapse. If you haven't surmised, I am using analogous colors that are with a complement. The blues and violets will be yellows and oranges will be the complement, and so I am trying to use the analogous colors of the blue, red, and violet, and then the yellows would be the complements. Now the one thing a lot of beginners don't realize, browns are really reds and oranges that have been knocked down in value to the darker end of the red and orange scale. If you were to mix this in with an oil or an acrylic, you'd be using some oranges and reds and knocking those colors, the brightness or the chroma, down. So let's get some of this in here for some of the morning sky that's darker, that's maybe above some of these fog clouds, where the clouds break up and the fog starts to lift and it gets a little fuzzy up around the top of those clouds. And this fog is going to go into the red oranges. I need more reds in here to get some of that effect, but you'll see that as I do the time lapse. And you can see that it's already starting to knock down and become more unified in value as I get some of those brighter colors knocked down with these darker value hues of the color palette that I've selected. And even the light, you see how that's all knocked down over in here. Alright, let's go to time lapse and get it started so you can see things more rapidly as I progress and I destroy this and start to use some wet techniques over it. Notice the dark spot and how it got faint. I realized as soon as I started trying to use wet pastel that there was too much powder, so I had to wipe the whole image off just enough so it would leave ghost. And then I followed the ghost with the wet materials after that. Okay, back to full speed. As you can see, this is not for the faint of heart. The alcohol that I put on there is starting to dry, so you can see little by little, especially in this area right in here, how it's still a little wet, and some of these areas over in here that I went into last, and over in this tree area. But look what the alcohol does. It's going to give me places where, even though it's dark and misty and early morning fog, I'm going to be able to put some trees. I'm going to be able to put some tree trunks in some of those areas that before were solid and all blocked up. You can only see just a little bit, a hint of the car left here. Just like thumbnail sketches and just drawing value studies in little 1.5 or 2-inch square or 2 by 3-inch square value studies in pencil or charcoal. This is a shorthand. There's enough there that I can recreate that car. And I've put in, wiped away some of the alcohol here that you can see that had the headlight lamps going out. And the same here. This fades off as the night light from this barn will come down across the siding of the barn and across. And I've got maybe a nice little joint here. This drip is a nice little joint for where the two doors on the front of the barn might be. So there's some neat things happening only because I destroyed this. But the best thing that's happened is that the values have gone down to the darker end, and the light is reduced greatly by me going to the darker end of the value scale rather than the light end. So there's some potentials here, and once it dries we'll get back into it. Now in some of these areas here, and where the light comes down, the light's going to come out of the car. If I was doing oil painting in acrylic, the paint would be thicker. The paint would have an impasto there, and I could put glazes and things like that. But with pastel, you can't do that. So what I do with my wet pastel techniques, which if you want to learn more about this, then I will be having online workshops in wet pastel. And this is maybe for more advanced pastelists. But what I do is I take a little clear gesso, which has pumice in it, and into that container I'm going to mix some of this golden coarse pumice. And as you can see, you can see all the texture that's in there. Just a little dab of that. There's no formula of this percent to that percent. It's all done by feel. Then I use some of this golden molding paste, which is thick. As you can see, I tilt it up here and it does not move. So this is going to create that thick area that if I was an oil or acrylic painter, which I used to be an oil painter, this will create in those highlight areas some texture that I can scumble over colors later on during this process. So when you see me putting some highlights in near the end, it's because I've created a base underneath using wet pastel gesso, coarse pumice gel, and golden hard molding paste. So that's what's going on with a brush in just a few of the places to create some texture. This is after the impasto and the textures and the molding paste have dried. I've gone in now and tried to darken up some of the areas and create more of the tree trunks and firm up some of the light areas. You'll notice how I've changed the angle of the lights coming off of the car to a little bit more of a more distinct angle. The impasto gives me nice highlights. Okay, this isn't done. It's maybe back to the 80% before I destroyed it, but it's far enough along that you can see some of the texture that I added during the process to create that sense of impasto. The textures will catch just a little bit of the highlights that I scumble over. The time lapse showed some of the process. It's taken several hours at this point because this is a 24 by 32. So it takes several hours to work on a large piece like this. But you get the idea of how the texture can add to layering, and so wet pastel techniques, if you use multiple materials and you don't just use wet pastels to block in the piece, you can get some interesting effects. They are a challenge to work with. I would not recommend this for a beginner, but some of you folks, if you want to experiment with adding texture in order to create little ridges that when a little light touch with a pastel going over the top of these things will create some really neat layered effects. So hopefully that's given you some ideas. Here it is a few days later with a lot more work done to it. It's a long process. So until next time, we'll see you in the next tutorial.